welcome to all of you today. It is fantastic to be here with you today after an excellent first day on Tuesday, where we were looking at the work that NORAG has already done on innovative financing mechanisms. And today the focus really is on impact bonds. Arushi, could you start the slides, please? Thank you. So with these learnings that we have had over the past few years of our work, we're very proud to have all of you here today. We had over 200 participants on Tuesday. We're looking forward to similar numbers today. And you'll see from this slide and from our website and our strategy on our website that private sector approaches is one of 5 themes in NORAG's work. The first theme in our strategy is data and evidence, and that really is focused on the ways in which data and evidence can be used to enhance policy and planning and practice. And our flagship project in that particular theme is all about missing education data, whether it's missing groups of people, missing types of evidence, or missing reasons why we would collect data. And with education and the SDGs, that's really looking at the contribution that education makes to achieving all of the SDGs. And innovations and disruptions. Here we're looking at the different ways in which we can use innovations positively in education, as well as mitigating against certain negative disruptions and seeing some positive as well. And here we have a project looking at digital in education with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education. And also our biggest project in this particular theme is that we are hosting the GPE Global Partnership for Education Knowledge Innovation Exchange hub for Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. A lot of very exciting information coming out of that project, which you can find on our website, as with all of our projects. And then here today, the work that we're looking at fits in with our private sector approaches work. And that private sector approaches work, the focus here is absolutely on how it is that we can and also that regional knowledge. And another critical part of NORAG's mission, which is to ensure knowledge equity. So we are always trying to do our very best to make sure that underrepresented voices from the South, underrepresented expertise is made more available and more used in all of the different spaces in which we work, whether it's in research or policy or practice and capacity building. And Arushi, could we move on one more slide? So this philanthropy in education is where one of the main places where NORAG started its private sector approaches work in education. And as you can see, we had a series of regional conferences, these symposium series, but these symposia were not only held in regional places, they were also very much about trying to make sure that we're understanding regional differences. There is not just one philanthropy in the world. There are geographical differences, historical differences, contextual differences within that. So very important contribution of NORAG to work on philanthropy has been this focus on regional philanthropies in the plural. And the NORAG book, Philanthropy in Education, as well, and the NORAG special issue on new philanthropy and disruption, as well as a blog series And we will be continuing that work through some series of presentations in the CIES conference in April. And building from that, we then also started looking much more in depth into innovative financing for education. So the past few years, there's been an enormous amount of extremely high quality work happening, developing case studies and teaching material, which was co-funded with Swissuniversities. We are currently developing an executive education program, which will be between NORAG, the Graduate Institute, and also IEP UNESCO, the International Institute for Educational Planning. And this research project that you'll see the cover of our research proposal there, more and better financing, IFE to leave no one behind. And that's co-funded with the Swiss Development Cooperation Research Desk and Education Unit, as well as important contributions from our partners that we'll be hearing from today. And on request, expertise on IFE. And I can certainly think of no better way to start off this 45th anniversary year of NORAG than with these two events that are really showcasing not only an extremely high quality of work, but also a very, very high quality of working with partners in the South, and the way that it is that we can work together to co-produce something that is simply better, more useful, and richer than if we had each done our work in our own little places. So thank you so much, Arushi, for your leadership of this work. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from all of you today. And I hand over first to Marina Trefrotte, who is going to talk us through a little bit about what happened on Tuesday, if you missed it, and also give us an introduction to impact bonds. Marina.
Today, I'm going to be doing, as Maria said, a quick recap of what we covered in day one and a brief introduction to impact bonds as well. So first of all, let me briefly go through what we already have done on IFE at NORAG in partnership with several organizations. So first of all, a conceptualization of what IFE means through a systematic literature review that is covering what is it that research already found out about IFE. And then a series of in-depth case studies on Argentina, Ethiopia, 2 cases in India and 1 in South Africa. And we are going to be hearing about some of them today. And then we have also a series of short cases, 3-4 page cases. 10 are already on our website and more are to come, and they explore some innovative financing experiences in the Global South as well. And then we have a series of mechanism animations as well, which are very simple videos explaining the structure of innovative financing for mechanisms and how they have been either applied to education or proposed to education. And then last but not least, we have developed a lot of teaching material on innovative financing for education as well. And this has been already applied in a master's level course, and it's going to be soon applied in other courses for education finance professionals as well. So, but as I said, not all of this is done by NORAG itself. We have great partners that have been engaging in this research with us, and some of them are SUDAC COFER consortium members, University of Fribourg in Switzerland, Pedagogical University in Zurich, Switzerland as well, the Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento in Argentina, Beijing Normal University, China, Tata Institute for Social Sciences, India, and Berta Center, University of Cape Town, South Africa. And we also have some innovative financing for education partners that are implementing partners that are engaging with research. So those are UBS Optimus Foundation and Volta Capital. And we also have some funding, our funding partners, which are Swissuniversities for the first project that we mentioned, SUDAC COFER, and of course, as Maura mentioned, SGC, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. So before we kick kick off with the agenda for today, let me briefly go through what we already covered in day one. So we covered a very brief introduction to innovative financing, and Arushi also shared with us what is it that we have already learned through this work and through this research agenda. And we then had a case study on results-based financing for vocational education training that we discussed, a case of impact investment, so a case study of impact investment in India, a student financing mechanism that we looked at, the Lending for Education in Africa Partnership, LEAP. And then we closed the session on day one with some reflections on the field and also with a discussion on future research and capacity building agenda. So for today, let's start by thinking what is innovative financing, of course, and how does this connect with the topic that we are looking at, how does this connect specifically with impact bonds. So we have these various innovative financing for education mechanisms that we hear about: income share agreements, impact bonds, of course, debt swaps, income, contingent loans, so a variety of them. And of course, each of them have their own design and sometimes their own debates as well. But at NORAG and with our partners, we're interested to learn through them and to learn how they connect in this umbrella called innovative financing for education mechanisms. So on that, we are working with this definition of innovative financing as an umbrella of these different mechanisms that connect to each other because they all have a creative financing structure or arrangement that is aiming at facilitating the movement of funds from the sources that are interested in providing funds to a specific purpose to those domains or sectors that need funds to carry on their activities. So there are two crucial elements to these as well. One is that they aim at raising additional funds from existing or new sources of funding, that is the more, so more funding for education, but also the better, so maximizing efficiency and effectiveness of the available funds to reach intended results, so making those funds go further. So that is the definition we work on. But of course, today we're looking specifically at one of these mechanisms and what we've learned about it already, which are impact bonds. So before we move forward, let's make sure we are all on the same page of what impact bonds are and what is their basic design. What we are going to be seeing today is that there is a common structure, of course, that we are talking about, but each impact bond will have its own specific contractual aspects and design that we're going to be learning through different cases as well. But let me start with a basic structure. So, of course, in an impact bond, so in an impact bond, there's always a contract that starts with an investor providing working capital to a service provider to implement a specific program. And on that, there is, from the onset, a set of agreed results that are expected from the service provider. And then, of course, the service provider implements that program based on the working capital provided by the investor to a set of beneficiaries. And from that, of course, how is it that we're going to learn whether these outcomes were achieved or not? There is an outcome evaluator that comes into place that conducts an independent evaluation on the program that was delivered by the service provider to understand whether outcomes were achieved or not, and what is lagging behind. And of course, these outcome evaluators is then reporting on these outcomes to what we call an outcome payer, who is paying for the achieved results. So an outcome payer is going to be paying back the investor on the basis of the results achieved. So it might be that not all results are achieved, and then the investor will not be receiving the whole investment, the whole funding that was provided to the service provider back from the outcome payer. But if results are achieved, that means that the investors are getting their money back. And then, of course, there is a third scenario in which there is an overachievement. And in some cases, depending on the contractual arrangements, it might be that the investor is getting a profit out of these overachievements of outcomes as well. So all of this to say that this is a very basic structure. There are several differences as well. So for example, in some arrangements, there will also be a financial incentive to the service provider for achieving the results. So at the end, the outcome payer might be providing additional funds to the service provider based on the achievement of results or on the overachievement of results. And whether these are already several stakeholders involved. Normally, there are more stakeholders involved, what we call the intermediaries. So there might be legal firms, any management institution that is involved that is going to be providing the structure, of course, for this contractual arrangement to work, and also any management support that is needed to ensure that the service provider is on track to deliver the results and any adjustments that are needed along the process. So, but what I didn't talk about with who is the outcome payer, right? So there are two important differences, which are social impact bonds and development impact bonds. There are two formats to impact bonds, right? So those differ on who is the outcome payer. So for example, if who is paying for the outcomes is the government, then we're talking about a social impact bond. In the case of a development impact bond, then it's the donor that is paying for the results achieved at the end. And that donor might be a philanthropy, a foundation, or a donor agency as well. So those are two types of impact bonds that we're going to be looking at today, and we're going to be understanding a little bit what are the potentials and challenges with them as well. So, but let me go through some common features of impact bonds and other innovative financing for education mechanisms as well. So there is a common feature that is that we will be seeing not in all innovative financing for education mechanisms, but in a lot of them, which is the leveraging of funds from private capital markets, business-like approaches. So accountability, efficiency, management practices are involved in a lot of these mechanisms. There is also a focus on results, as we just talked about impact bonds, results-based financing, the measuring of social outcomes. There are also new actors that are entering this arena, which are private investors, philanthropies, foundations, development finance institutions. And of course, there is always the idea of a financial solution. So there's a financial structure that is being proposed as a solution for an education challenge. And today we're going to be learning a little bit more in detail about how this has been playing out and what we've learned from a few cases of impact bonds in education already. And those are the cases that we're going to be looking at are the Impact Bonds Innovation Fund from South Africa. We'll have our partner in the University of Cape Town talking about it. We're also going to be looking at Proyecta do Futuro, a social impact bond for education, employability in Buenos Aires, from our partners in Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento, Argentina. And then we're going to be looking at the India Education Outcomes Fund with our partners in TIS, Tata Institute of Social Science. Next, we're going to be listening a little bit from the implementer side as well. So we'll have the lessons learned on the use of impact bonds in education from the UBS Optimus Foundation. And last, we'll also look at future research, what is next, looking forward to what we've learned, what is it that we are taking this learning forward, and what are the new questions that we're going to be addressing with, and Arush is going to be walking us through this. And then we're going to have some closing reflections from Nicholas Burnett. So without no further ado, let me pass the floor to Cynthia from Bertha Center to walk us through the Impact Bonds Innovation Fund in South Africa.
Great. Thank you, Marina. And let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, just want to make sure that that's clear. Can everyone see it? Okay. Okay, wonderful. So I am Cynthia Rayner. I'm joining you from the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of Cape Town, where I'm a senior researcher. And the research that was done on the impact bond was conducted over the course of 2020. So I'll be walking you through some of the research, as well as talking about the structure of the bond, as well as some of the results. Just a little bit about the research. We really focused a lot on the design and development of the bond, who were participants in that, kind of what was the process, what was the experience, and then through the actual implementation of the bond, looking at what was the experience of those who were involved with both the design and development and then the implementation and provision of services through the bond. So we will get into kind of all of that over the course of these 10 minutes that I have to share with you. Okay, so just to set the context, early childhood development is defined as services that are provided to children in South Africa from conception to 5 years. And as of 2017, the bond was launched in 2018. There were close to 7 million children under the age of 6 in South Africa. And 4.7 million of those children were in the lower 2 socioeconomic quintiles. So it would be kind of primary audiences for the services that we are going to be talking about. Over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, the South African government has made significant strides in developing strong policies for comprehensive ECD. And by comprehensive, I mean that it includes not just education services, but also health, prenatal care, maternal health, as well as social development services. And it's treated as a public good. They've really transitioned from what I would consider to be a subsidy approach, so subsidizing services, to actually an interventionist approach, really trying to think about the design and quality of the services. But there are still significant challenges around the coordination and the funding and the delivery of these services. And really the bond was looking at trying to address those challenges of coordination, funding, and delivering ECD services in really challenging circumstances. The design and development of the social impact bond that we're talking about here today, it was conceptualized by the Bertha Center very early on, but then it was handed over to many different players throughout the process. It was also conceptualized, developed in collaboration with social finance. And these were days when social impact bonds had not yet really even reached the African continent. So this social impact bond was one of the first to be launched in South Africa. The early project design was from 2013. And then there were handover to intermediaries, both Volta Capital and Mothers to Mothers, in 2016. So we'll talk about a little bit about how that happened. And then just an important note that while the design and development was expected to take about 6 months, instead it took 4 years. You know, this was a massive process because it was one of the first bonds on the continent. So taking 4 years involving nearly 20 organizations and 150 individuals. You know, this was quite a massive undertaking in terms of just the coordination and development of this bond. So to give you an overview of the bond itself, it was, as I mentioned, one of the first social impact bonds transacted in South Africa. It had quite a small scope, aiming to deliver services in the Western Cape province of South Africa through one provincial government, the Department of Social Development. But this small transaction was really designed to be a model and something to be replicated in the country and for other areas as well. The timeframe for the bond itself was 3 years, so running from 2018 through 2020. And the program that it financed was a home-based learning program in 2 underserved areas, serving 2,000 children. The investment that was put into these services, the outlay on the part of the investors, was about $500,000 US or 7.5 million Rand. And that was coming from 3 institutional but mission-oriented investors. The max annual returns of this bond were set at 16%, and we'll show what the financial returns were for the bond given the outcomes. The targets, because this is an important piece to impact bonds, is what were the targets that the IBIF was trying to achieve. The first of those was this enrollment number of recruitment and retention of 2,000 children aged 3 to 5 years and over 3 years. And there was a second target, the attendance target, so ensuring that children receive at least 50% of their home visits each year. And the true outcome measure of this bond was something called the Early Learning Outcomes Measure. This was actually a South African developed measure of early learning outcomes, but it was a relatively new standardized measure at the time that the bond was being launched. And so really the choice of what the target was going to be here was somewhat of a, I'm going to say, a measured guess. It was really trying to decide what would be the appropriate expectation for children to be able to be achieved over the course of this period of time in terms of their learning outcomes. And we'll talk about what, in a second, we'll talk about what the outcomes actually were. This it's a bit of a complex slide here, but I want to walk you through it because I think it's important. The structure of the bond follows that very basic structure that Marina walked us through. It mimics that, but it has a couple of unique features that I'd like to point out as well. You'll see on the left-hand side there that these were at the top 3 boxes, the 3 institutional mission-oriented investors that invested into the bond. The first of those was a community foundation, but associated with Standard Bank, a large bank in South Africa. The second was an international investor based in Zurich, LGT Venture Capital. And then the third was a local institutional investor called Future Growth. And each of those investors, as you can see here, put in different amounts, but with the same expected rate of return or max rate of return. On the right-hand side, there are the 2 outcome payers that were to repay the investors with the return on delivery of outcomes. And what's interesting about this bond was that one of those outcome payers, as would be expected, was a government outcome payer, the Western Cape Department of Social Development. But in order to ensure that there was additional funding coming in to augment services and deliver the quality that the bond hoped to achieve, they also had a matching funder that came in called Chikalulu Social Investments. One of their funds matched the funds on the Department of Social Development. And the other thing I want to point out is that this central entity, the IBI-NPC, is actually a special purpose vehicle that was set up to both receive the funds from investors, contract with all of the different parties that were delivering the services and therefore the outcomes and auditing them, as well as receive the repayments and then deliver the return and repayment back to the investors. And then the third piece here that is important is that in addition to the service provider, the Western Cape Foundation for Community Work, who was delivering those home-based services, there were also 2 intermediaries, Mothers to Mothers and Volta Capital, who were delivering technical and financial structuring support to the IBI-NPC and then vicariously through to the Foundation for Community Work. So a couple of interesting features here. And these are the differentiators that we really just talked about, but I want to highlight them to you. First, that it was a home-based program. So in the context of South Africa, a lot of ECD service provision is done through center-based care. So this idea that services, quality services, could be delivered to home-based caregivers, kind of a door-to-door model with home visitors coming and capacitating caregivers on the way that they were delivering nutritional support, health support, and educational support to their children, was a I'm going to say riskier investment, but it had the potential to deliver very cost-effective benefits to children who were not able to be in institutional care or center-based care. The second was this intermediary support, so a line of support from Mothers to Mothers to the service provider, Foundation for Community Work, as well as structuring and financial support to the NPC, that special purpose vehicle, on the part of Volta Capital. And then finally, this matching outcomes payment from a philanthropic donor that was doubling the funding available for the intervention that the government was able to provide. Okay, last couple of slides here. I want to show you the programmatic returns of the bond. After 3 years, FCW, the service provider, had delivered and exceeded the recruitment goals. You can see here that it's 1,000 children each year, but then 2,000 children over the course of the bond. And in fact, that was exceeded. The second target being the children receiving 50% of their home visits. While in the first year, there was a slight underperformance, they caught up and were able to retain those children in care over the next 2 years. And then lastly, that the true outcomes target of this bond, the ELOM, or the early learning outcomes measure, it did underperform. So in that year one, there was a real learning curve of trying to see whether this particular outcomes measure was appropriate and the target was appropriate for this particular audience and for the service being delivered. So I would say that even though there was an underperformance on that, there was a real learning curve there and an important set of learnings that they then carried into year two. And you can see that the improvement was achieved in that year two, in that there was an improvement in the score between year one and year two. And there was no ELOM contracted for year three. So, and that was part of the actual initial structuring of the bond. So we don't know, but we can expect that there was hopefully even further improvement in year three. On the financial returns, the annualized return for the bond was 14%. So that's a slight shortfall to the 16% that was anticipated, or the max returns. And that was due to that non-achievement of the ELOM target. And then the repayment by both the government entity and the matching philanthropic donor came out to 1.24 US million, which is 18.7 million Rand. And that was by the end of the program. So over the 3 years, the investors both received their money back, as well as a significant financial return. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you to NORAG for providing the funding for us to do this research, to conduct 30+ interviews over all of the participants in this bond development and implementation, to the Bertha Foundation, who also continues to fund our research work, and the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. And then also to all of the people who participated in the interviews. We were able to do close to 40 interviews, all of which people were willing to do and willing to really be involved in the learning process, which is a testament to their commitment to the project.
It most certainly was. Thank you so much for those really interesting reflections there on that particular project, Cynthia, and also those principles introduced by Marina. So in the chat, we've had a couple of questions. The one that I think I would like to highlight is around the intermediaries that are involved in impact bonds. And the question is basically, does that not bring the risk of reducing what could actually be spent on program delivery? And that's a question from Tatiana Feitosa de Brito. So would one of you like to take that question?
Marina, I can jump in, and then you can absolutely add. And I would even open it up to Joe De Silvio, who is here as well from Volta Capital, who is one of the intermediaries in the bond. Based on that was one of the key questions that we were really trying to explore in the interviews of what is this role of intermediary, and how does it enhance the delivery of the service, and or detract from, as you mentioned, the funding that can be available for service delivery. I think in the case of this bond, there was the unique fact that it was one of the first bonds to be developed in South Africa, and there was a real need for technical support to the provider, particularly on the M&E measures that they were expected to achieve in order to support the target measurement. And I would say that in the conversations with the service provider, there was a strong recognition that the Mothers to Mothers intermediary was a real strong capacity builder for them on their M&E system. They did have an M&E system in place, but it was really enhanced by the work that they did with Mothers to Mothers over the course of those 3 years. And that system, or at least the principles of that system, continue to exist in that organization to this day. On the financial structuring side, the intermediary this is Volta Capital, was absolutely critical, because the structuring of that special purpose vehicle, which could still exist as a future recipient of funding for further bonds, was really important. They wouldn't have been able to do it without the support of Volta. But I hear the comment about the funding, that it was expensive as well. So I think that there always has to be an important conversation about whether that investment in those additional quality measures are worth the investment made. I see that Joe has his hands up. I would love to hear from Joe as well, if that's okay.
So we'll hear from Joe.
Hi, everyone. Yes, happy to jump in here quickly. So I think it's a great question. And Cynthia, you hit on a lot of the points I would make as well. So I think because IBIF 1, a specific part of this was around capacity building, and actually that was a mandate from the government. So in that case, the FCW as the implementer, there was a part of this bond that was about building up their capacity to do the M&E work and all these things, which was quite a significant piece of work and has been sustained beyond the bond. That would not have been possible without this kind of intermediary structure, both to set up the bond itself, but also just to get them set up to actually measure these type of results and run a program like this and use them to improve their effectiveness and all that. Now, if you have it depends on the implementer, because if you have a very high capacity implementer that can do all those things already, then maybe you don't need all those layers of support. But in any kind of impact bond arrangement, somebody needs to do all that work that the intermediary does. And a lot of the bonds, you'll hear about other ones today, have that role, just because it is quite a lot of work to get these things structured, launched, and then to actually just manage all these stakeholders with kind of very diverse interests and incentives and all that, even from just like a stakeholder management governance perspective. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a separate intermediary necessarily that does that function always, but somebody has to do that work, and it's a significant piece of work. The final thing I would say is that in the early days of impact bonds, it was often looking, we have this new structure, let's try to figure out a place to use it, right? So kind of a hammer looking for a nail. And nowadays, for example, we're looking at structuring another much bigger scaled up version of an ECD kind of results-based financing instrument to follow on from IBIF 1 in South Africa. But we're not necessarily saying it needs to be a bond. In fact, there's all sorts of different mechanisms you can use that will still keep a results-based focus. And the only reason you'd use a bond is if you really need that risk sharing from private investors to put the money up front. And you really want, that piece to be featured prominently, something that's kind of innovative and testing new ground. But it doesn't always have to be the case, and it's not always the best value for money necessarily. So that's something we're keeping in mind as well. So those are just a few thoughts, but yeah, I will pause there.
Thank you, that's great. So there are answers coming into the chat to some of the other questions that have come in already. I'm just going to call on Sietse from the Optimus Foundation before we move on to the next speaker.
Super. Thanks, Cynthia. Thanks for the presentation. Quick question. It might already be answered in the chat, but unfortunately, I can't see the chat. You mentioned a return of 14%. I just wanted to know if that was a return in US dollar or in South African rand, because it wasn't clear to me what the currency of the return was.
In South African rand.
South African rand, okay.
And it was an annualized return over those 3 years.
Yeah, okay. So effectively in US dollar terms, that equates to like 8%, if you correct that. Yeah, okay.
Great.
Cool, thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We will need to move on to the next presentation. There has been an important set of questions and answers in the chat already, which hopefully we'll be able to deal with both in the chat and then also in person through the rest of the afternoon. So the next presentation we have is on a project called Proyecta tu Futuro, which is a social impact bond for education and employability training in Buenos Aires. And that is going to be presented by Felicitas Acosta, who's at the Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento, and Thomas Esper, who's at Teachers College in Columbia University. Take it away.
Thank you, Moira. So thank you all for being here, and especially the NORAC team for putting together this symposium and the opportunity of participating in the project. As Moira said, my name is Felicitas Acosta. I'm a senior researcher from Argentina, and I'm going to talk about Proyecta tu Futuro, which could be translated as Expand Your Future, which is a social impact bond developed by the government of the city of Buenos Aires between 2015 and 2021. I will present together with Tomás Berg, with whom we elaborated the case. It has been largely discussed throughout this symposium that innovative finance mechanisms aim to tackle a socially relevant problem. In our case, this was a twofold one: low graduation in secondary education and high unemployment among young adults in the city of Buenos Aires. During this presentation, apart from presenting our key findings, we would also like to propose an analysis and discussion on the challenges and the limits of this kind of mechanism. Of course, we do not attempt to provide definitive conclusions around any of these issues, but rather pose some questions. So, to move on Tuesday's session, Arushi highlighted that in respect to innovative finance research, it was time to move into a new phase, like testing the promises of these several mechanisms. So building on what Marina Drawford just shared with us today, I will just briefly review some of the characteristics of these social impact funds, and especially connected to the one we took a look. So among the great variety of non-traditional financing, we can find bonds, notes, loans, debt swaps, and others. Here, what we see with social impact bonds is that they consist in a performance-paid contract for public services whose focus is set on the outcomes and who seek for improved social outcomes. So, as we can see in the slide, there should be a policy problem to be tackled and a potential intervention or program which has already shown good results addressing this issue. And there are many participants or actors intervening in social impact bonds: the commissioner, the private external investor, the third organization sectors, who are the ones who are the service providers, the intermediaries, as we were just talking about them, and then of course the independent evaluator who assesses the results. Next, please. Key to our analysis was to focus on the momentum for social impact bond expansion, to understand why this impact bond in Buenos Aires in 2015. So the momentum was related to the financing crisis in the global education sector, the estimation that low and middle income countries such as Argentina will require to more than double their domestic public expenditure from spending in education, the gap between the global recommendation for public finances for education of up to 6%, while we know that many countries allocate a global average of 4.7% of GDP to education, and the fact that global aid to education had also decreased. So in this sense, what we find interesting is that to us, the social impact bond turned out as a case of a traveling policy. These bonds emerged in 2011 in the UK by the hand of Social Finance, and now there are more than 240 bonds around the world, and at least 80 of them are in development. So this was a tool created in the global north, and with premises that had to be tested in developing countries. What we saw, and it was of notice for our case, is that in 2014, the Inter-American Development Bank launched the IDB Lab. And this was a lab to facilitate the implementation of SIBs in Latin America and the Caribbean. So initiatives gradually started to grow, and they took place in Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. There are, of course, some promises and challenges, as this has already been noted on Tuesday. Bring together the interest of the public, private, and third sector is a promise. Improve the efficiency of public financing. Adopt an evidence-based public policy approach, and of course the enhancement of public policy transparency. So these are the promises, and as we will see going through our case, we'll try to show how if these promises were reached or not. So we explored the case of Proyecta Tu Futuro, the first social impact bond in Argentina, developed by the government of the city of Buenos Aires. This was a bond designed to tackle low secondary school graduation and high risk and high unemployability among young adults. It was the first of its kind, and the goals included training in soft skills for up to 1,000 young adults aged 17 to 24 living under vulnerability conditions. This training also assured helping them graduate from secondary school and obtain and sustain a long time their first registered employment. To do so, we conducted a two-phase research, including in-depth interviews, review of policy documents, and of course the review of Argentine legal framework, which was key to understand the complications that arose around the implementation of this bond. The background problem in Argentina and that the bond was aiming at was, as I said, twofold. It had to do with education and employability of young adults. So here to the left of the screen, you can see the performance indicators of the education system. And of course, there is a really high enrollment in secondary education, but the graduation rate is low. It is estimated that in secondary schooling, 1 out of 5 students abandoned school. And this has, of course, consequences in the access to the labor market. When it comes to unemployment, Argentina's rate in 2018 for young adults was around 25%, and this was similar for the city of Buenos Aires, where unemployment in 2019 affected 11% of the population, but up to 20% of young adults. And of course, this situation has deepened amidst the pandemic. Of course, the city of Buenos Aires had employability programs. They were spending around $30 million and reaching more, yes, almost like 100,000 people, but this program in particular put together employability with educational issues. The benchmarks for this bond, as we have already outlining the SIVISA's mechanism, had to do with improving graduation rates and employability of young adults. So how would this mechanism work? As I said, the intervention was focused on a training for employability and future placement in the labor market by also a specific tutoring to help this population finish their secondary education. The scale and scope of the intervention was 1,000 young adults living under vulnerability in the southern neighborhoods of the city of Buenos Aires. There was an upfront investment, as you can see the figures in the slide, and part of this came from an IDB grant, which was used by the city of Buenos Aires for the feasibility and structuring phase of the bond, which, as we will see, took a lot of time. As regards to the outcomes, repayment, and we will see this is one of the most interesting aspects of this bond, and we will come to this later. The repayments were scaffolded into 4 different objectives: graduation from secondary school, obtaining a formal job, sustaining the job for 4 months, and sustaining the job for a year. And each goal had a cap, a maximum amount that the government would repay. And there was a total repayment, and we will show these figures later.
Okay, so I'll continue. Thank you, Feli, and hello, everyone. So let me walk you through a little bit of how this bond came to life. Here we have a timeline of the project. And if you look on the left half side of the screen, where it says ideational phase, but what we find out during the research of this case, that contrary to the idea of social impact bond being a purely rational decision of having a problem and the bond being the appropriate solution to tackle, it came more from an interest within the government, from policymakers within the government to test the tool in the country. So they pitched the idea internally, and once they had internal buy-in, what they did was put together an internal working group created in 2006, as you see there. And as Joe was pointing, the problem of employability and graduation was decided later, once the idea of having the social impact bond was in place. And unemployment and graduation from secondary education, as Feli showed before, gather all the necessary conditions. It was a big issue for the city. There was internal buy-in from the Secretary of Employment in Buenos Aires. There were enough service providers able to tackle the issue, and finally it was attractive to investors. So in the beginning of 2016, on what we have called the pre-feasibility phase, is when the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, show up. After this idea being pitched to them, they offer to the city of Buenos Aires a $600,000 grant to put together the bond, with which they hire social finance from the UK, and afterwards a group's partner, which became the key intermediary in this bond. Then in 2016, the whole market research for the bond took place, including finding the providers, finding the investors, and refining the issue. But anyways, as in South Africa, it was a quite lengthy process, mainly because of the legal framework. Argentina didn't have a pay-for-performance contracting scheme, which entailed a lot of extra time, not planned ahead. Anyways, in 2018, finally, the project took place and began the implementation phase of the bond. And as you can imagine, because of COVID in 2020, some adjustments were needed, which entailed another 6 months to finish the program. So here on this next slide, what we want to show you is, picking up of Marina, the beginning, the structure of the bond. As I said, we have the IDB kicking off the bond with that grant. The city of Buenos Aires is the commissioner of the bond. Then we have the investors, which will put on top of the grant, of course, the working capital, which equivalent to something like $1 million. The investment was in Argentine pesos. We have the performance manager, which was ACRU's partner, which was an intermediary throughout the whole process. Then the 4 NGOs, which deliver the implementation, the targeted population, and beyond these, the independent evaluator, which took care of assessing the results for the repayments. Finally here, as Feli mentioned before, we want to spend a minute talking about the results. There were 4 outcomes for these projects, which were scaffolded into 4 different goals, as you see on the left-hand side. The most important part that we want to highlight is that there was a maximum to be repaid per outcome as a way to incentivize both the investors and the providers to reach the higher tiers. These are the results up to October 2020, when we finished the study, which something like 30%, above a third of the participants have obtained a job. And this was in line with the expectations and above other governments' projects. So to wrap up, because I think I'm running out of time, some of the challenges and opportunities that this bond left for the city. First of all, it was really complex to coordinate among the different stakeholders, mainly because this was a new tool and none of them was familiarized with the role to play. There were some overhead costs hidden. Without the grant, it would be really expensive for the government to do this. Argentina didn't have a legal framework fit for it, and the sustainability within a developing context with devaluations and other financial problems also took place. On the bright side of it, anyways, it helped to emphasize outcome-based policymaking. It also helped with the transparency within the government, and also with share risk. I'm gonna stop here because I ran out of time. Thank you so much. We had some outstanding questions for you, but thanks for your time.
And thank you both for that fascinating insight into these bonds in a very different geographical location. So we have some questions in the chat. So first, just picking up a question that was asked in the previous presentation and is still with us in this one, mainly from Thomas Paulson and Keith Lowen, questions around the outcome payer being the government or donor. Is there a risk in having that payment being made to an intermediary rather than investing that payment directly back into educational systems?
The thing with this bond, or this case in particular, it was the first of its kind. It was it had a very low scale, and there were many complications during the implementation. So if we take a look at the results, I would say this is not really creating additionally to educational financing, because in the end it didn't. And it might seem that it was more like a cost for the government because they had to pay the grant to the IDB, and the results were as expected, but in terms of impact, the population they have reached, well, it was as I said, low scale. So I think the question has to do, and this came up a lot during the interviews, especially with ACRUX, that unless there is like they mentioned an ecosystem for this kind of bonds, and they have like a larger scale, then it all comes down to like a lot of bureaucratic work, increase, and many complications or not so many good or expected good results in effect. But I would also add that there are some takings from the experience, and this has to do with promoting better use of data, high transparency in the use of data for the internal state bureaucracy. Of course, that was our question: do we need a social impact bond to get that kind of result in social public policies? I don't know. But anyway, I would say that due to the fact that this was the first one to implement, and it's due to its low scales, I wouldn't go further with projections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then there's a question from Franz Lenglet on longevity. What guarantee exists that the impact will continue to last after the bond has been paid out?
Well, maybe Tomas wants to add something about, because he mentioned a very important fact, and the fact that how this bond appeared and how the idea of the bond appeared. And it was like these two officials that had learned about social impact bonds in their graduate studies abroad, and so they were interested in testing it in the city of Buenos Aires. So originally there was not like this view of using this sort of instrument or mechanisms like in the future, but rather to test it, to test the idea that they have learned about abroad. Of course, there is an input for the NGOs, and I think that's another interesting result, because these NGOs were already working on this, on training, on labor training skills, and now they, in a way, were connected to the problem of low graduation of secondary school. So there was a new connection, I would say, of a topic that tended to be seen apart, which was low graduation and entering the labor market. And this may, in a way, enforce or reinforce the work that these NGOs were doing. And this is also an outcome for, or a takeout, I would say, for the government, that they need to put these things together. I don't know, Tomás, if you want to add anything.
Simply really brief, that one of the things that was intended within the bond was this idea of sustaining the employment for longer periods, which trigger larger repayments, as a way of ensuring, at least for participants, or protect them as much as possible to keep the job. Because in Argentina, after 3 months of being employed, you gotta have a full-time contract. That's the only thing I could add.
Very interesting. So there's that sort of systemic effect, depends also on the system in which the intervention is happening. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Right, so next we're going to hear from Archana Mehendale, who's at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, about the India Education Outcomes Fund. Archana, over to you.
Thank you, Moira. Let me just get my slides on. Thank you, and hello everyone. This teaching case study is about the India Education Outcomes Fund, the IEOF, as it is called for short. At the outset, actually, I must mention that the IEOF was still under development when this teaching case study was prepared in late 2019 and early 2020. And so it focuses on describing the process by which this platform was set up, rather than results of their interventions. Let me start by briefly explaining the context. In recent years, India has seen an increased involvement of the private sector. According to one report, this investment is evident in core education, that is provision of K-12 and college, parallel education, which includes preschools and tutoring, as well as an ancillary education, which includes textbooks, education technology, etc. And this accounts for nearly $56 billion annually. And although the government remains the single largest contributor of education financing, its allocation has consistently fallen short of the 6% of GDP target, although it is provided for in the national education policy. And as a result, it is estimated that the size of the funding gap for meeting the SDG 4 is approximately $740 billion for the period 2015 to 2030. And this gap in funding is seen as a threat to the opportunity of reaping the demographic dividends in India. And in addition, because of India's economic growth and global positioning, foreign aid inflows to education have declined, and there is a greater emphasis on domestic resource mobilization, including the statutory obligation on private companies to allocate a part of their profits for social causes. And also, according to some market reports, India is seen as one of the most attractive markets for impact investment worldwide. So coming to the IEOF particularly, IEOF is the first outcomes fund dedicated to education in India. And it was established by Social Finance India in 2018 with the main goal of providing sustainable and innovative funding at scale to deliver educational outcomes. And it envisions creating a transformational impact in Indian education through funding $1 billion of outcomes-focused activities by the year 2030. And within the education sector, it has identified 5 thrust areas on which innovative financing mechanisms would be developed, which, as you can see, cover the entire spectrum of the education sector. The theory of change and the problem statement given in its prospectus indicates that the IEOF is seen as a response to issues which are impinging on the government funding, as well as issues faced by the service providers in the education sector. As was mentioned earlier, the current government spending is not only inadequate, but it is also seen to be restricted, with a major chunk going towards teacher salaries, leaving few resources available for innovative activities, even at the school level. And government funding is also seen as being more input-based rather than being directed towards production of outcomes. And on the other hand, service providers are insecure about funding, and they have very little flexibility to try new ideas, design strategies, or expand. And on this background, IEOF sees the need for ensuring greater accountability with a focus on production of outcomes. And since the IEOF aims to create impact at scale, it actually goes beyond the typical bond structure like we see here, and which has also been discussed by the earlier speakers, where we find one or more investors provide working capital to a single service provider, who then deliver programs to identified beneficiaries. And then upon achievement of outcomes, the outcome payer makes a results-based payment to the investors. So the IEOF actually aims to address the limitations of such individual bespoke development impact bonds and create impact bonds at scale. So what is the difference? And this has also been discussed in the earlier Argentinian study in terms of the costs of actually designing the development social impact bonds in that case, but impact bonds in general. The DIBs are often seen to have higher costs because they require customized contracting, lengthy negotiations, and individualized M&E frameworks, leaving relatively lesser funds available for the actual intervention. But on the contrary, the IEOF seeks to increase efficiency by actually accelerating the contracting time by standardizing contracts, developing pooled funds, using a rate card approach for delivering specific outcomes, and having standard M&E frameworks. And scale is expected to be achieved by creation of larger pool of outcome funds, wherein multiple similar contracts would be made within a given thematic area. So there would be a bunch of 5 or 6 outcome funds that will be receiving funds, having similar contracts, similar outcomes within a given thematic area. So in this context, IEOF itself is meant to act as an intermediary and get outcome funders, get risk investors on board, establish payment metrics, conduct due diligence of service providers once they are taken on board, monitor the performance, and pay the risk investors once the outcomes have been validated. So as I mentioned earlier, the case study highlights the process by which this ecosystem was being created. And I thought I will focus the 10 minutes that have been allocated to me. I will share, I'll focus my attention on sharing some of the key insights and reflections shared by some of the respondents, as well as our own observations of what we have learned about the IEOF. So firstly, the respondents pointed out that the impact bond as an instrument is not an appropriate answer for all the educational challenges. Sometimes it leaves out smaller niche service providers who may be doing significant work because they may just not be in a position to absorb the kind of funding that an impact bond seeks to bring in. And this may actually lead to segmentation of the education sector, where certain interventions are seen to be what they call dibbable and others are not. The second challenge that the respondents pointed out was with regards to the existing regulatory framework in India, and this has also been referred to by the earlier speakers. So the legal and the tax norms impose a number of restrictions on philanthropies, foundations, as well as CSRs, from where most of the funds are coming from currently for these structures. There are restrictions on who can invest, who can earn returns, how monies can be invested, how returns can be repatriated to offshore investors. And therefore, designing instruments requires one to straddle between commercial imperatives and social imperatives, and somewhere balance between the two regulatory worlds that exist, the norms that are applicable to the financial sector and the norms that are applicable to the charities. And there is also a strong criticism that the idea of tapping into non-conventional funding is not occurring, because it is the same philanthropic funding that is getting tapped and channelized into impact bonds. And as I said, currently there is the CSR that is being seen as primarily coming forward and as a risk investor. And however, while this is true, currently the philanthropic organizations serve as risk investors in the impact bond structure. And they can be seen as offering nuanced charity, because they can keep reinvesting the funds to get multiple outcomes with the same funding. So some may not see this as a financial innovation at all, as it doesn't bring additional funding to the sector. But these innovations are actually aiming to improve efficiency and produce outcomes, and therefore make the existing funding go even further. And this designing of these instruments is also seen as a balancing act. In fact, the process of fixing targets brings about an interesting dynamic between the risk investors and the outcome payers. In fact, the targets are too high and the program is too risky, then the risk investor is unwilling to put in funds. And if the targets and risks are too low, the outcome payer will not see the need for a risk investor and may directly fund the service provider. And then there is also an issue of supporting experimentation and proven initiatives. And the challenge is to actually search a sweet spot which balances the two. So one concerns are about only proven models will get selected for application, thereby discouraging actually experimentation. And lastly, given the importance of outcomes and their measurability for triggering payments, there is a concern about having to support what can be measured rather than what may be required or what may be worth pursuing. So here are the references, and I would like to thank all the respondents as well as this initiative for supporting us to do this study. And I'm open to questions and comments.
Thank you very much for that, Archana. The questions that we have are, again, around the investment capital. And also there was a question that came up earlier, which I think is applicable to all of the examples and case studies we're hearing about this afternoon, which is, what would you do differently this time?
Yeah, I think the main learning, I would think, during this initial phase has been, and I mean, it has been almost 2 years since this case study was done. So there have been, a lot of learnings that have been carried forward. And one of the main learning has been one has to look at how the existing regulatory frameworks, how can structures be designed within the existing regulatory framework. And this also answers the question which Keith is trying to raise about how much of the investors are domestic and offshore. So currently, the CSR being the main source of risk, that is bringing in risk investment. A structure has been created which is piloted in Haryana, Developmental Impact Bond, which has been working with government schools to improve language literacy, which actually uses CSR funding as risk investors. And this is a learning in the initial process. I think the setting up of the ecosystem itself, trying to bring in service providers, making sense of the regulatory frameworks, seeing who can come in as outcome payers, who can come in as risk investors, has actually informed this process of structuring the piloted DIB. And government is still not involved in this process currently. They are still on the sidelines and observing.
Great, thank you so much. And again, that thinking about, as you say, the regulatory framework and the system in which you're intervening, where in India there is an obligation for CSR as opposed to it being something that you might choose to do should you want to. Fantastic, thank you so much for that. Right, so we're going to pass over now to Sietse Wutte, who is with UBS Optimus Foundation, and he's going to talk us through some of the lessons that they have learned on the use of impact bonds in education. Sietse.
Thank you, Maura, and I hope you can all see my screen. I hope that that's all working. Perfect. So I'll speak a little bit about our learnings in impact bonds, and particularly in education. And I'll do that on the basis of our impact bond experience that we've actually had in India. I'll briefly speak a little bit about UBS Optimus Foundation, just introduce the foundation. We're a Swiss foundation. We have presence in a number of countries where UBS is present. And we've been very active with impact bonds, or we prefer to say outcomes contracts actually these days, since 2015 when we funded the Educate Girls impact bond. We really prefer to say outcomes contracts these days because a bond, as you know, in the financial sector associates certain ideas, and it's actually proven very unhelpful for us to continue using that phrase. So you'll hear me use both terms interchangeably. Outcome contracts are one part of the broader social finance strategy that we have at the foundation. And really key to our approach is shifting to funding outcomes and results rather than funding activities. And our strategy is focused on 3 pillars. So first of all, that's supporting the ecosystem for outcomes. So that's through grants or through funding research or through testing pilots of ideas that can eventually become outcomes contracts or investments. The second is the actual investment. So that's investing in impact bonds, but that can also be investing in debt. So we give out loans, for example, to social enterprises. That can also be equity. And we do that also in some hybrid forms. So we could give grants that convert to equity, etc. And the third part of our work is really trying to use blended finance, so using our funding at the foundation to draw in additional funding from the private sector, so from the bank effectively. The bank has a huge amount of clients who have a huge amount of assets, and we really would like to use that opportunity that we have here at the foundation to draw more of that funding into impact investing. But I'd like to zoom in a little bit into our experience on impact bonds, particularly in education. So we've, like I said, invested in impact bonds and supported them since 2015 with the first Educate Girls impact bond, which started in 2015, ended in 2018, and was actually a very small program and was really successful over its 3-year period. In the first 2 years, it actually underperformed, and there was a lot of soul searching in the program and evaluation of why results were lagging. And in the 3rd year, a number of changes were made in the program to really improve results and actually overperform over the 3-year period. Like I said, it was a very small impact bond. 7,000 beneficiaries in 166 government schools. And that's something we've then subsequently scaled up into much larger impact bonds in India. The first of which is the maternal and newborn health impact bond in Rajasthan, which actually has just finished, and the results have come in, and that's overperformed, which is really great news, and has done so in difficult circumstances with COVID, of course, affecting India significantly. But more importantly for this audience, of course, the Quality Education India Impact Bond, which is also a much larger impact bond, around $10 million of outcome funds, is a 4-year program and is now in its final year of implementation. So actually in its last 4 months of implementation. It's also been significantly impacted in the last 1.5 years, 2 years, with COVID and with school closures, and in many cases schools are still closed and have only just started to reopen. Service provision during this time has really moved to hybrid models. EdTech solutions have been integrated into the service provision, but we do expect learning in these last 2 years to have been impacted significantly. We have done some dipstick assessments, and we have seen that in the schools under the DIB there have been relatively better results as control schools, but we'll have to see in the last 4 months how the results bear out. So over the whole period of the DIB, we're still confident that we will overperform the initial targets. Which brings us to the learnings, which is why you're all here. So a number of learnings that we take from the DIBs, and these are particularly, and in no particular order here, but one really important thing is making sure that the incentives are aligned, and importantly, the outcome funders see the benefits once impact is increasing. And so what I want to say here is that, of course, you set certain targets with the stakeholders, but what is really important is that once you start also overachieving on those targets, that outcome funders can see that benefit in a lower price per outcome. I think that's really, really important to build that into a program, because that's for the outcome funders who are key stakeholder in this, that's really important to see that the price per outcome comes down, especially with overperformance. Second learning we have is selecting the right partners. It's really, really important to work with partners that are actually able to work in an outcomes-based structure, that are able to innovate, that are able to think flexibly. And that means, in our case, that for certain programs, we've really had to choose to work with certain providers and not with others. One of our third learnings is that we've found that outcome contracts are actually very well able to deal with uncertainty. And we've seen that particularly during COVID, where both in the health impact bond as in the education impact bond, it was these programs are really able to pivot and shift, and to also do so quickly. There is a lot of pressure in these structures to perform and to make decisions quickly. And that allows the various stakeholders to make these decisions, but also there is the freedom for the service providers on the ground to actually change the way they operate. And that really has allowed both of the impact bonds, the Utrecht impact bond and the Quality Education India impact bond, to really pivot during COVID. One of the fourth learning I'd mention here is the importance of active performance management. So once the program is underway, it's really important that either the service providers can manage themselves, or there is a performance manager as an intermediary that can really ensure that you get the most out of this program, and really adapt and challenge the service providers to adapt. And without that, it is much more difficult to really get that increased impact and to show that benefit to the outcome funders. So something we feel is really important. And the same applies here as in my second point. It's really important to select the right type of partner here, an intermediary that actually can performance manage effectively. And then the final point I'd like to mention here is higher learning outcomes. So what we've seen specifically in the Quality Education India impact bond is that we have strong indications of higher learning outcomes within the program compared to non-results settings for the same organizations. So organizations that are in the program, we see much better results for their work within the impact bond compared to some of their work outside of the impact bond, and also compared to control schools. And whilst, of course, this is not perfect and the comparisons are really difficult, I need to make reservations for that. We do have very strong indications that outcomes are better. And that, of course, results in a better price per outcome. So with that, I'd like to just mention one thing. So we are really quite convinced about the outcomes contract model, so much so that we've now launched a much larger outcomes-based fund that will invest in outcomes contracts. So it will invest in 15 to 20 outcomes contracts over the next 10 years, and will bring in private investors next to the foundation. So the foundation will provide concessionary capital, and private investors will come and provide additional capital. So this $100 million fund will focus on areas such as health, employment, the environment, and importantly, of course, education. And with that, I'd like to open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was extremely interesting and important to hear that perspective. And we have a question here from Ziria Taurelli, who's asking about who the commissioners were of the project, who was involved in the design. So before you're even selecting partners, who's taking part in that design?
So I think that, yeah, that's a very good question. And so in the Quality Education Impact Bond, the two outcome funders were the Michael Susendell Foundation and British Asia Trust. And why it's a very good question is that as an investor, we've really seen that sitting down with the outcome funders at the beginning that's the key where the program is shaped. It's important to understand what the outcome funders want to achieve, and to also be clear what you want to achieve, how you can achieve it, and to ascertain whether it actually makes sense to do that program with an impact bond or in another way.
And then moving on to the next question, there from Sampath Daniel, asking about then, are these programs only in India? So then my question to link to the previous question is then, how do you take it when you're designing it and think about how it actually fits into the educational and sort of development ecosystem into which it will intervene, which is something that was raised by previous speakers as well.
Yeah. So not only in India, so we are working much more on impact bonds as well in other developing countries. I would say India has a bit of an advantage, particularly in the early stages of development, because there is so much knowledge. There are very, very, very good local service providers, performance managers, and that does allow you to do projects that are effective, cost effective, and that experience is now growing elsewhere as well, and we'll see that developing now in other countries as well. But you don't, for example, in India, you don't need to fly in international NGOs, international service providers. You work with local partners, and our experience has actually been much better with local partners because of the shorter lines and more responsiveness.
Thank you. And Tatiana Fetos is asking about why it is that UBS took that shift in language from bonds to outcomes contracts.
Yeah, it's because we when we speak to our own funders, and we speak to investors, and we speak to our colleagues in the financial sector, they get confused because actually impact bonds are not bonds. So an impact bond is a structuring approach, and it's not a bond. It could be a bond, but it could also be a lot of other things.
Right, so it's about the technical vocabulary in the financial sector rather than anything else. Fantastic. Yes. And then picking up the question from Keith, and he's asking about how it is that these indicators give the impression that outcomes are then sort of like bought, as he says, at a point in time, and actually what it is that is needed for education systems is actually something that's in the long term. And then also putting my own system spin on the question, looking backwards, because the system that you're bringing, all of you are bringing these impact bonds into, has received certain financing from governments and donors and other places before the impact bond outcomes contract falls into place. So how is it that then you how is it that then you're thinking about both the investment that has already come before you get there, and then also how you can actually move that forward through time rather than it being a short-term thing, which sometimes it can come across as when it's being communicated in these ways?
Yeah, so a couple of questions there, and so firstly, I think it's important to when you try and organize and structure a program, that you try to bring in all costs. So also the structuring costs. I think that's important to make a fair comparison. I think it's been quite difficult with some of the earlier programs to make a fair comparison also amongst some of our academic colleagues, because there have been a lot of additional add-ons pasted onto some of these programs, which makes it a like-for-like comparison a little bit more difficult. But I think a lot of our colleagues are getting quite well versed at this and are able to kind of see the forest for the trees. So that's one. I think the second one is sustainability question is very important. I think there's a number of angles there. I think one is what we're seeing is that, for example, the Education India program is really empowering the service providers, and they're taking that knowledge and applying it into their non-DIB programs. I think that's one important effect that we're seeing. I think another important effect is do governments, are governments or authorities or other private schools able to take on these learnings and apply them? And I think there we're seeing quite an interesting development in the program that EUF is developing in Ghana, where the government of Ghana is coming in and really committing to taking some of the best programs under the EUF Ghana program to roll them out nationally. And I think that is a really interesting approach where there is still a donor, the UK government coming in providing the kind of bulk of funding, but there's actually a very committed government that has a very clear vision on what they want to get out of this and how they want to apply that. So I think that's a very good model for trying to get longer term sustainability.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over next to Arushi Teraway to talk about the future research in terms of this theory of change of innovative financing. And I think she will be addressing the question that Bindu Thirumalai has put into the chat in her comments now. Arushi.
Thank you very much, Moira. And I want to thank all the speakers for giving such detailed information about each of the case studies. I just want to show that these are case studies about impact bonds. They function in multiple sectors. They don't have to be in any one sector, whether it's education or another sector. And even with education, they work in different levels of education, different types of priorities. So one of the questions I saw coming in was how is quality of education defined? It depends on the program that is being bought. So it's the outcomes that are defined by all the actors, and then service providers have to reach that. Lots of interesting questions coming in, and as the lead for innovative financing for education at NORAG, I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how we've come to this, but we don't have all the answers yet. This is a very new field still. There are lots of pilot programs and proof of concepts, and we're now moving on to the next generation of programs. In some learnings that have come from pilot projects, but more learning needs to come, and more improvements need to happen, especially with understanding of where and when these models can be used, and they're not a solution for every education challenge. So I want to remind everyone of the definition that Marina gave earlier and that we use, and I gave 2 days ago. Innovative financing is just a general term, and impact bond is one of them. It's about creative financial structures and arrangements to ensure that we somehow get either additional money from existing and new sources, or maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of existing funds. So a lot of times impact bonds, yes, they're taking money from private investors. That's not necessarily additional money in the case of adding new money to education, it's borrowing working capital in the beginning and paying that from a revenue stream later. But the model itself is doing something to improve effectiveness and efficiency. That's the theory there, but that still needs to be tested. So with that, I'm going to just right up front tell you that there are lots of outstanding questions with this still, with all innovative financing models, and definitely with impact bonds. While most impact bonds are showing that the service providers have been very effective in reaching their results, what we don't know is if that's happening because of the impact bond, or that would have happened with a simple grant or some other kind of financial model. We don't know if it's more efficient or not than normal traditional financing ways. Another thing we don't know is, we talk about risk a lot, that there's a risk sharing happening between private investors and the government or whoever the outcome payer is. But there are actually different types of risks, and we need to explore a lot of that a lot more. And then additionality. All of this modeling, does that actually bring in additional money to education? There are no calculations for it yet. It is actually very difficult to calculate, but there are going to be attempts to make some of these calculations. So that's the research agenda that NORAG is going to be taking over with our partners. In very, very simple terms, what we are going to try and explore is how do innovative financing models, including impact bonds, stack up to traditional financing, especially in reaching marginalized and vulnerable populations. So we're trying to see if the financing mechanism itself is having the impact on education, rather than the intervention on its own, which is a very difficult question to ask. So we are starting a new research project for the next 5 years. We have 3 research partners: NORAG, Bertha Center, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and we have 2 implementing partners, Volta Capital, which was involved in the Impact Bond Innovation Fund in South Africa, as you saw, and UBS Optimus Foundation. In this project, we're going to be looking at models that work at different levels. We're going to be looking at student financing that work directly with beneficiaries, impact bonds that work with service delivery, service providers, and then impact bond funds that Sietse had mentioned and the India Education Outcomes Fund mentioned, where there would be a fund that will have multiple bonds in them. Some of the reasoning for that is that it's going to reduce a lot of the transaction costs that come about with having a new financing mechanism. This is the research hypothesis that we're going to be testing, but let me show it to you in a diagram form. This is the overall theory of change that we are going to be testing. That the dark blue are the features of innovative financing: outcomes-based payment, private sector management practices, innovative financing mechanism, the structure itself, and private capital coming in. We're going to see if those features are leading to improved effectiveness of the programming, better efficiency, new financial partners, and more beneficiaries because that working capital is there. All of these together are supposed to, in theory, reach the more and better financing goal for marginalized populations. This is just a hypothesis. This is the theory of change that we need to be testing. We have included a counter hypothesis to go with that, because that is a general critique that comes in when profit-seeking or financial return type of models are introduced in education, is whether having financial return model somehow excludes the hardest to reach population. We are going to be specifically testing for that. So that's our overall research agenda. And just a quick plug on, please keep looking out on our website for more information on what NORAG is going to be doing. It's going to be this particular project, the research project. We are about to publish another study on results-based financing for subnational governments. And we are also going to be doing an executive education program for finance and education professionals very soon. So I'm going to stop there and pass on to Nick for now to give his reflections, and then we can open up for Q&A for everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Arushi, and thank you to everybody for this very fascinating 2 days. At the end yesterday, Alicia Taylor mentioned her involvement in the early writing committee of the leading group task force on education. I was also a member of that writing committee, and it was very, very interesting what she said. And I just want, as I reflect now, you know, some 12 years later, 11, 12 years since that, this field has moved very, very far. But interestingly, there's still very little, actually, despite our spending 2 days on innovative finance in education, there's still actually very little innovative finance in education compared to several other sectors. And secondly, there's still a remarkable lack of information and knowledge about this innovative finance in education. So I think it's great that NORAG has put this work together in this seminar, and will be continuing it in future. I'm going to make a few remarks about innovative finance in education in general, not just about social impact bonds, which has been our topic today. But to start, I do want to start with one point about social impact bonds. I think it's no accident that 2 of the 3 that were described today, and in fact, if you look more generally at those in education, they tend to be not so much around compulsory education, not so much around primary or secondary education. They tend to be around early childhood development, around employment training, things like which we put 2 examples today. I think that's quite an interesting question that we need to do much more work about, which is which levels of, are some levels of education more appropriate for innovative finance than others? That's an important, I think, exception to this point I'm making is the quality education impact bond in India, which was not one of the NORAG case studies, but is one of the USB ones that Tsitsibutas described very clearly. And I think that one is definitely worth paying a lot of attention to. A second general remark I'd like to make is, well, what does innovative finance for education not do? What it doesn't do clearly, and after I think 10 years of trying to get it to do it, it's clearly not going to do. It doesn't provide the massive finance that's needed to fix the financing gap to achieve SDG 4. And obviously don't have time to go into what is needed for that today, but I think we've seen a lot of things in the comments that tell us what's needed. And I would say 2 main things. The first is, as Keith Lewin and Maria Ron Balsera and others have pointed out, we need clearly to pay much more attention to tax. There may be innovative ways of paying attention to tax, by the way, and of increasing revenues. But I don't have time to go into that today. And the second thing, which I would argue, which is a personal view, is that actually we need to change SDG 4. It's simply unachievable, and it's out there, and it's going to be a failure. And so we need to really, I believe, stop talking about everything as if it's going to fill the gap for SDG 4, and in fact define SDG 4 much more rationally. I've argued about that elsewhere. I won't go into it anymore. So I have innovative finance for education won't fix the SDG financing problem, but I do think it can be a very useful adjunct to conventional financing. And that conventional financing, by the way, can involve borrowing and does involve borrowing. I mean, remember that much of higher education in, say, United States or in Japan has been financed by the issuance of bonds by education institutions. And of course, a lot of education in especially middle-income countries is financed by borrowing from international aid agencies like the World Bank. And a very interesting example there is the African Development Bank a few years ago issued a bond in Japan to finance education in Africa. So this is just a conventional bond. It wasn't innovative finance, but it did combine these interesting concepts of one, a financial return, and two, achieving a social result. And that was a very successful bond. I mean, the Japanese were very, very, falling over themselves literally to purchase that bond, a conventional bond. Another general remark I'd like to make after the last couple of days is, whatever the mechanism, whether it's an impact bond or any of the other mechanisms we heard about, there's absolutely no doubt that equity is an issue. And so we just need to be upfront about that, I think. But it doesn't mean, to me, that means that you shouldn't do things just because there are equity risks. Rather, you have to be clear about them. And I believe much more work is needed around the area of weighting results, since much of innovative finance also involves results. Weighting those results in equity terms, pricing them more in equity terms. I just think much more work is needed around there, which has been done, after all, with in the past with other things. So-called poverty weights were popular about 20, 30 years ago in World Bank lending, and these are interesting ideas which could be, I think, very easily applied. Next point has to do with results-based financing. As we've heard, almost everything in innovative finance has to do with funding against results. But only one mechanism, the one we've actually discussed today, the impact bond, provides the working capital that's needed for organizations to achieve the result. And so a huge issue with all the other mechanisms, and indeed with government adopting innovative financing techniques, is where does the operational capital come from? Or put it differently, what needs to be the balance between financing the result and just financing the operation? And I don't think we know the answer to that question. GPE, for example, has a ratio of 30% results, 70% operational, but who knows that that's the right percentage. I think that's an area that needs significant work. I mentioned earlier on that innovative finance in education has not achieved the same levels as in some other sectors. I think it's interesting to wonder why that might be. Again, we don't have a lot of time. I don't have a lot of time to go into that, so I'll just list some points. One which we've heard a lot during this seminar is considerable skepticism within the education community about private, let's say, both about non-state education and about involving private capital. I would also add there's a general conservatism within the education sector, which we don't see in some other sectors. There is, of course, the long period to results. There's this whole question of working capital that I just touched upon. There's a lack of good indicators before the final education outcome is achieved, because it takes a long time, and because there is disbursement against results, we don't have very good indicators to use in the interim, and I think much more work might be needed there. And of course, there's also the difficulty I've alluded to in a different context already about pricing outcomes. How exactly do we price an educational outcome? So I want to conclude by saying, again, thanking everybody for this. I hope these are some general remarks. I want to repeat that innovative finance for education is not going to be the solution to SDG 4. That is going to be revenue, raising more revenue. But it is nonetheless very, very useful, innovative finance, especially with its focus on results, on outcomes, and also, perhaps I should have mentioned this earlier, in its involvement of NGOs. So as we heard from Asitsi Wutas also, it's very important actually to who those NGOs or those partners more broadly are. It's not just a matter of generalizing, saying bringing NGOs in is a good thing to do and so on. It's a question, I think, of also which ones. Much more monitoring is needed. Two final points. More monitoring is needed. Not so much of impact bonds, where we have obviously great work going on by Brookings Institution, by Oxford Blavatnik School, and so on, but more about all the other innovative finance mechanisms. But we don't have any systematic monitoring mechanism. So maybe we should think about asking the Global Education Monitoring Report, or possibly to think about that, and maybe some funder might want to think about funding that. And then finally, more research is clearly needed. And I do think that the way Arushi posed it for NORAG is actually applicable more broadly to everybody. I mean, is in fact innovative finance, or can it meet its promise of more and better financing, as she put it, of additionality, of effectiveness, of efficiency? And finally, I would say, can we actually generalize about innovative finance? I myself increasingly think probably not. I think increasingly we have to look at particular mechanisms in particular places, and the generalization is, saying it's a good thing or it's a bad thing, or this is a good mechanism or that one is a good mechanism, is actually highly context specific, which does make, of course, it quite difficult for researchers to pluck out what are the key and central points. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. And that level and the importance of those questions are absolutely critical going forward, not an acceptance that it is either always right or always wrong, but teasing out exactly those questions that that Arushi and Nick have just laid out for us. So in the remaining 5 minutes, the first person that I would like to invite to ask a question is Bindu Thirumalai. Bindu, over to you.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting 2 years and many new learnings for me. But I've been a little confused, and I've consistently asked this question about especially education and quality of education. And you find, and as Arushi said, each intervention or each defines this through the outcomes that they expect, right? And they define it because they expect certain outcomes, but they define what is good education before that, to say that these outcomes are good. And my concern is that, so who does this? Does the service provider who's selected do this? Or because the concern of quality is quite complex, right? And do educators have a say in this, or is it more because of the financial side of it? I understand that this, the focus is on the financial aspect, but I don't see a talk about how these qualities and indicators get defined, and there is no one common understanding, right? It's every intervention defining its own, and who says that what they define as good outcomes are indeed good quality education? That's a dilemma.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. So who gets to decide what counts as quality if these outcomes are indeed trying to contribute to that? And how does that change from place to place in terms of that localization agenda as well? Which of our speakers would like to address that question? How was quality addressed in your projects?
Could I either volunteers yet say, or Joe to answer this with the actual negotiation with all the partners and your impact bonds?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and then maybe Joe can add. So I think one thing that's really important with impact bonds, with these types of structures, is the design stage, where you decide on the structure and actually define what quality looks like for that program. that, because that's actually how you're going to be measuring that program in its over the course of the 3, 4, 5 years, and hopefully overachieve on that, because I guess that's always the target, what we try to do in the programs. That inevitably always comes then with a question during the program and after the program: did you define quality in the right way? And so you have a discussion then at 2 levels. Like, first, you designed a program to a certain standard, and then you measure yourself according to that standard. And later the question comes: did you choose the right standard? And that question, I guess, will always be there. That's why it's also, I think, relevant in certain cases to evaluate the program afterwards to see whether that was the right standard. And also why work such as the work that NORAG is doing actually is very relevant, as you can look across impact bonds, across programs, to see whether that design was done in the right way, if I may, and that really quality was achieved.
Thank you. Joe, did you have anything else to add in the last minute? Yep. Okay. Well, all that's left for me to do is to thank all of the people who have spoken today, all of you who have contributed such amazing questions in the chat, and also the chat function has truly been a chat function. There have been many responses and a very lively chat happening in that parallel channel. So thank you all very much for that. And thanks especially to Dr. Arushi Teruwe for her leadership in this program, in NORAG's work, and with our partners to absolutely get us to this point where we can showcase some of the work that has been happening, be part of what has happened, and also very much part of asking and answering the right questions going forward. Thank you so much for that. The feedback, link to the feedback form has just been dropped into the chat. We would very much welcome your feedback through that form. And also, obviously, you can still contact us through our website as well. And you can also sign up to become a NORAG Network member in the same place on our website. So thank you all so much for spending the last 2 hours with us. And we look forward to bringing you the next stage of our journey very soon. Thank you all very much. Good night, good afternoon, and goodbye.